Nobody in Blackwater County slept that night because of the fire alarm. And the worst part? There wasn't any fire. Snow drifted sideways across the empty streets of Blackwater, Montana, turning the old mining town into a blur of white and amber light. The neon sign outside Miller's Auto Garage buzzed weakly against the storm while inside. Ethan Cole slept in a rusted folding chair with an old Marine Corps blanket pulled over his chest. The place smelled like motor oil, burnt coffee, wet wood, and the faint metallic scent of winter creeping through cracked walls. Somewhere near the workbench, a radio whispered old country music beneath the sound of rattling pipes. Ethan hadn't meant to fall asleep there. Truth was, he rarely slept anywhere else anymore. At 38 years old, the former Marine carried exhaustion the way some men carried wedding rings. Quietly, permanently. His dark hair had started graying near the temples long before it should have, and the scar cutting across his jaw caught the flicker of the garage light every time he shifted in his sleep. Across the room, Mason Reed snored loudly beneath a pile of jackets on the couch, one boot still on, the other missing somewhere near the tool chest. Then came the sound, a sharp metallic crash, followed by frantic scratching. Ethan's eyes snapped open instantly, years of military instinct dragging him awake before his mind fully caught up. What the? Another crash echoed through the garage. Mason jerked upright. Tell me that ain't another raccoon. Before either man could move, the fire alarm exploded overhead with a violent screech that shook dust from the rafters. Red emergency lights flashed across the garage walls. Mason stumbled off the couch half asleep. Fire. Ethan was already moving, boots slamming concrete as he scanned the room. No smoke, no flames, just chaos. Near the back shelf, a tiny German Shepherd puppy spun in frantic circles with a plastic peanut butter jar jammed over his entire snout. The puppy crashed into a mop bucket, slipped across the floor, then slammed directly into the emergency fire lever mounted beside the exit door. The alarm screamed louder. Mason stared in disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. The puppy froze for one dramatic second, jar still stuck on his face, before blindly sprinting forward again and crashing into Ethan's legs. Behind him stood Duke. Massive, silent. His sable coat shimmered dark beneath the flashing red lights, while snow melted slowly off his broad shoulders. The older German Shepherd watched the disaster unfold with the exhausted expression of a parent who had completely given up. Ethan crouched carefully and grabbed the squirming puppy. Hold still, buddy. The puppy sneezed loudly inside the jar. Mason started laughing first. One short burst that escaped before he could stop it. Then another. Soon he was doubled over against the toolbox, laughing harder than Ethan had heard in years. Ethan tried not to smile. He really did. But when the puppy suddenly licked the inside of the jar so hard it made a ridiculous squeaking sound, something cracked loose inside his chest. A laugh escaped him too. Small, rusted, unfamiliar. Duke's ears twitched at the sound. The older dog slowly walked closer and rested his head against Ethan's shoulder as if confirming something important. Outside, snow continued falling over Blackwater. Soft, quiet, endless. But inside that broken garage, for the first time in a very long while, it no longer felt completely empty. By sunrise, the entire town knew about the fire alarm incident. Blackwater was the kind of place where news traveled faster than snowstorms and lasted longer than winter itself. The small diner across Main Street buzzed with quiet laughter as truckers warmed their hands around coffee mugs and retold the story with growing exaggeration. According to one version, the puppy had nearly burned down the garage. According to another, he had somehow learned how to operate emergency equipment better than the volunteer fire department. Mason enjoyed every second of it. I am telling you, he said proudly from his stool at the counter. That little fur missile looked me dead in the eye before hitting the alarm. The waitress laughed while refilling his coffee. Sounds smarter than most men in this town. Ethan sat near the window booth, silent as usual, shoulders hunched beneath his dark flannel jacket, while snow drifted past the glass in soft waves. Duke lay beneath the table at his boots, calm and watchful. The puppy, Milo, sat wrapped in one of Mason's old sweatshirts beside the heater vent, chewing enthusiastically on a wooden spoon somebody from the kitchen had given him. Every few seconds he made strange little grumbling noises deep in his throat, like he was trying to argue with the spoon itself. Ethan stared at him longer than he realized. The diner smelled like bacon grease, cinnamon pancakes, wet denim, and burnt coffee. Familiar smells. Human smells. The kind Ethan had spent years avoiding after leaving the Marines. Crowded rooms made him uneasy now. Loud sounds lingered too long in his head. Some nights he still woke expecting desert heat instead of Montana snow. Mason slid into the booth across from him. Shelter called. Ethan took a slow sip of coffee. And roads are closed till tomorrow. Snowstorm rolled through the pass. Mason shrugged. Looks like the dogs stay another day. Ethan grunted softly, pretending the news meant nothing. But under the table, Duke's tail thumped once against his boot. The older German shepherd always seemed to notice things Ethan tried hiding from himself. Outside, a gust of wind rattled the diner windows hard enough to make several people glance up. Milo immediately barked at the sound, then proudly barked again at his own echo from the tile floor. A little girl near the pie counter burst into laughter. Her mother smiled apologetically, but Ethan surprised himself by whistling softly toward the puppy. Milo froze mid-bark. His floppy ears perked. Then the tiny shepherd launched himself straight across the diner floor like a runaway football and skidded directly into Ethan's legs. The entire diner chuckled. Even Ethan's mouth twitched faintly upward. "You are getting soft," Mason muttered. "Shut up." But the words carried no heat behind them. The waitress approached holding a paper bag. Kitchen made extra sausage links. She handed it carefully toward Ethan. "For the boys." Ethan looked down at Duke first. The dog remained perfectly still, disciplined despite the smell. Milo, however, was already vibrating with excitement hard enough to shake the booth seat. Mason laughed under his breath. One of these dogs has military training. The other has absolutely none. Ethan broke off a small piece and handed it toward Milo. The puppy snatched it too quickly, choked for half a second, sneezed loudly, then looked personally offended by the experience. For the first time in months, maybe longer, Ethan laughed without forcing it. Not loud, not dramatic, just real enough to make the room feel warmer. Duke lifted his head slowly at the sound and rested his chin against Ethan's knee while snow continued falling softly beyond the diner windows, blanketing Blackwater in quiet white silence. The storm deepened by late afternoon, wrapping Blackwater in a silence so thick it felt almost holy. Snow piled along storefront windows and buried parked trucks halfway up their tires while the wind carried loose ice crystals through the air like drifting ash. Back at Miller's auto garage, the old heater rattled constantly against the cold. Ethan stood beneath the hood of a faded blue Ford pickup, sleeves rolled to his elbows despite the freezing temperature creeping through the walls. His hands moved automatically across the engine parts with the quiet precision of a man who trusted machines more than people. Nearby, Mason struggled to untangle Christmas lights that had somehow wrapped themselves around a toolbox, his patience disappearing one muttered complaint at a time. "I swear these things reproduce when nobody is looking." On the floor near the workbench, Milo attacked a broom twice his size with fearless determination, while Duke watched him with deep, visible disappointment. Every few seconds the older shepherd sighed heavily through his nose like an exhausted babysitter reconsidering life choices. Ethan noticed it first. Duke was smiling. Not literally, but close enough. The big dog's amber eyes had softened over the last 24 hours. His ears stayed relaxed now. His body no longer carried that tense shelter stiffness. For the first time since arriving at the garage, Duke looked like he belonged somewhere. Milo, on the other hand, looked like a natural disaster wearing fur. The puppy finally conquered the broom and dragged it proudly across the garage floor before accidentally knocking over an old coffee can filled with bolts and screws. Metal exploded everywhere with a loud clatter. Mason jumped nearly 3 feet. "Sweet mercy!" Milo barked excitedly at the noise he created, then slipped across the concrete, chasing one runaway bolt straight under Ethan's truck. "Leave it," Ethan warned. The puppy ignored him instantly. Duke slowly rose to his feet, walked to the truck, and barked once. Sharp, firm. Milo froze beneath the chassis. A second later, the puppy crawled backward out from under the truck, carrying the bolt in his mouth, like a guilty toddler caught stealing cookies. Mason stared. "That dog has more authority than my high school principal." Ethan crouched beside Duke and scratched gently behind one ear. The shepherd leaned subtly into the touch before catching himself. as if affection was still something he had not fully relearned yet. Outside, the wind howled harder against the garage doors. Snow rattled the windows in restless waves. The storm was settling in for the night. Mason finally gave up on the lights and dropped into a chair beside the old space heater. "You know," he said carefully, "this place does not feel as dead with them around." Ethan did not answer right away. His gaze stayed on Milo, who had somehow managed to wedge himself halfway inside an empty oil box while Duke watched with silent concern. "Maybe," Ethan admitted quietly. The words hung in the warm garage air. Simple, honest, dangerous in a way neither man liked admitting. Because loneliness becomes familiar after enough years. Comfortable, even. And healing sometimes feels stranger than pain. A sudden gust slammed snow against the windows again, but inside the garage, beneath old hanging lights and the smell of coffee grounds and motor oil, something small had begun changing. Duke walked over slowly and rested beside Ethan's boots while Milo finally escaped the box and immediately tripped over his own paws. Mason laughed first, then Ethan, and this time the sound lasted longer. That evening the power went out across half the county. One moment the garage hummed with the steady buzz of old fluorescent lights and rattling heaters. The next, everything disappeared into darkness so complete Ethan could hear snow brushing against the roof. Somewhere outside, the wind groaned through the narrow streets of Blackwater like a living thing wandering between buildings. "Perfect," Mason muttered from across the garage. "Exactly how every horror movie starts." Ethan reached automatically for the flashlight hanging beside the workbench. The narrow beam cut through the dark, catching floating dust, shelves of rusted tools, and two sets of glowing amber eyes staring back at him. Duke stood alert near the garage door, posture calm but attentive. Milo, however, had apparently decided the blackout was the greatest event of his short life. The puppy launched himself directly into a pile of old tires and vanished completely. A loud yelp followed. Then silence. Mason sighed heavily. He got himself stuck again, did he not? Another muffled bark echoed from inside the tire stack. Ethan shook his head slowly and crouched beside the pile. "You are supposed to be a German shepherd," he muttered. "Not a raccoon." After several seconds of wiggling, Milo finally emerged backward with a dirty shop rag hanging from his mouth like a victory flag. Mason laughed so hard he nearly dropped the lantern he had just lit. Warm golden light slowly spread across the garage, softening the shadows and turning the old building almost peaceful. Outside, the storm continued building strength. Snow tapped steadily against the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere high in the mountains. Duke moved closer to Ethan and settled beside him near the workbench without being told. The big shepherd always seemed calmer during storms if Ethan stayed nearby. Milo finally tired himself out enough to collapse directly on top of Duke's front paws. Duke glanced down with visible annoyance, but did not move. Mason noticed too. "You see that?" Ethan looked up. "See what?" "That dog acts like somebody gave him full custody." Ethan snorted quietly before taking another sip from the battered thermos sitting beside him. The coffee had gone lukewarm hours ago, but he barely noticed anymore. Some habits stayed after the Marines. Drink coffee. Stay awake. Keep moving. The lantern light flickered gently across the garage walls, illuminating old license plates, hanging chains, and faded photographs pinned beside Ethan's tool cabinet. One photo showed 3 younger Marines standing beside a Humvee somewhere overseas. Ethan had not looked directly at that picture in years. But tonight, Milo wandered over to it. The puppy tilted his head curiously, studying the image as if trying to understand why the younger version of Ethan smiled differently back then. Duke rose slowly and joined him beneath the photograph. Ethan felt something tighten quietly in his chest. Mason noticed the silence settling over the room and wisely said nothing this time. The storm outside deepened. Snow buried the sidewalks completely now. Blackwater disappeared beneath white darkness while the old garage glowed like a tiny island of warmth in the middle of winter. Then Milo suddenly sneezed so hard he toppled sideways into Duke's chest. The older shepherd let out a long, exhausted sigh toward the ceiling as if asking heaven for patience. Mason burst out laughing again. Even Ethan smiled openly this time. And beneath the lantern glow, with snow falling endlessly outside and 2 shepherds stretched across the concrete floor beside them, the broken little garage no longer felt like a place men hid from life. It felt like life had quietly found its way back inside. Near midnight, the storm finally buried the last visible stretch of Main Street. Snow climbed halfway up the garage windows now, muting the outside world until Blackwater felt less like a town and more like a forgotten place at the edge of nowhere. Inside Miller's auto garage, the lantern burned low beside the old couch, while Mason slept beneath two army blankets, snoring softly with one hand hanging toward the floor. The heater clicked and rattled unevenly every few minutes. Somewhere overhead, the wind creaked against loose metal roofing like distant footsteps. Ethan sat awake at the workbench cleaning an old socket wrench that did not need cleaning. Some nights' exhaustion never reached all the way inside him. Those were the dangerous nights. The quiet nights. Duke lay nearby on an old quilt beside the tool cabinet, ears twitching occasionally in his sleep. Milo, somehow, had managed to climb onto Mason's chest and now slept upside down with all four paws sticking into the air like a tiny surrender. Ethan stared at the puppy for a long moment before shaking his head under his breath. "You make absolutely no sense," he muttered softly. Milo snored in response. Ethan almost smiled again. Almost. Then the sound came. A sharp breath. Too fast. Too uneven. Duke was awake. The older shepherd stood slowly, paws silent against the concrete floor as he crossed the garage toward Ethan. The dog did not bark. He simply stopped beside the stool and rested his head gently against Ethan's knee. Ethan froze. Outside, wind battered the building harder, but suddenly he was not hearing Montana anymore. His mind dragged him somewhere hotter. Louder. Sand. Smoke. Radio static crackling through darkness. The kind of memories that arrived without permission and refused to leave quietly. Ethan's breathing tightened before he even noticed it happening. His fingers curled unconsciously around the wrench. Duke pressed closer immediately. Steady. Warm. Present. Ethan shut his eyes hard. "Not tonight," he whispered. But trauma did not care about weather or exhaustion or how many years had passed. Some scars waited patiently beneath the surface until silence gave them room to breathe again. Duke lifted one paw slowly onto Ethan's boot. The pressure was gentle, deliberate. Ethan opened his eyes. The shepherd stared directly at him beneath the lantern glow, amber eyes calm and unshaken. Not afraid, not confused, just there. Ethan exhaled carefully through his nose. Across the room, Milo suddenly rolled off Mason's chest and landed on the floor with a loud thump followed by a deeply offended yelp. Mason jerked awake instantly. "Why am I under attack?" Milo stumbled in circles for a second before charging straight into a hanging extension cord and accidentally turning on an old battery-powered Christmas decoration sitting near the shelves. A plastic snowman began singing country music at full volume. Mason stared at it in complete disbelief. "You have got to be kidding me." Ethan laughed before he could stop himself. A real laugh this time. Rough around the edges, but alive. Duke's ears lifted immediately at the sound, while Milo proudly barked at the singing snowman like he had personally invented Christmas. Mason groaned and threw a shop towel at the decoration. The garage filled with laughter, barking, terrible music, and warm lantern light, while snow continued falling endlessly outside. And somewhere in the middle of all that ridiculous noise, Ethan realized something terrifyingly simple. For the first time in years, the silence inside his chest was beginning to loosen. Morning arrived slowly beneath thick gray clouds and the lingering hush of fresh snow. Blackwater looked buried alive. Storefront signs wore heavy white caps, trucks sat frozen along the streets like abandoned relics, and smoke curled lazily from chimneys into the pale Montana sky. Inside the garage, warmth returned one stubborn degree at a time. The power finally flickered back just after dawn, bringing life to the rattling heater and the old coffee maker Mason trusted more than most people. The rich smell of fresh coffee drifted through the building alongside motor oil, damp fur, and toasted bread from a crooked little toaster balanced near the toolbox. Ethan stood near the sink shaving carefully with cold water from a metal basin, while Duke sat nearby, watching him in complete silence. Milo had discovered a tennis ball sometime before sunrise and now raced wildly across the garage, chasing it into walls, tires, and occasionally his own feet. Mason shuffled out from beneath his blankets wearing thermal socks and absolutely no dignity. "I had a dream that Tiny Dog joined the Marines and outranked me." Milo barked proudly, as if accepting the promotion. Ethan wiped shaving cream from his jaw, the faintest grin tugging at one corner of his mouth. Mason noticed immediately. There it is again. Ethan frowned. What? That thing your face does now. Mason pointed accusingly. You keep smiling. Ethan tossed the towel at him. Drink your coffee. Duke rose slowly and wandered toward the garage door, ears lifting toward the outside world. A moment later came the soft crunch of boots through snow. Somebody was approaching. The bell above the side entrance jingled gently as the door opened and cold air swept inside, carrying the sharp scent of pine and winter. Standing there was Lucy Bennett, wrapped in a thick wool coat with snow dusting her dark red scarf. Beside her stood her daughter Emma, a quiet little girl around 8 years old with pale blonde hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. Ethan recognized them instantly. Everybody in Blackwater knew the Bennetts. Lucy worked double shifts at the diner after her husband passed away 2 winters earlier. Emma rarely spoke anymore after the funeral. Some folks said grief had simply folded her voice inward. Emma stayed close beside her mother until Milo spotted them. Then the puppy launched across the garage floor like a furry missile straight toward the child. Lucy gasped softly. Ethan stepped forward automatically. Milo easy. But the puppy stopped inches from Emma and simply sat down, tail wagging carefully. Waiting. Emma stared at him silently while snowflakes melted against the edges of her boots. Milo tilted his head once, then gently dropped the slobbery tennis ball at her feet. The garage became strangely quiet. Mason stopped pouring coffee. Ethan watched closely. Emma looked down at the ball for a very long time before slowly picking it up with both hands. Milo bounced excitedly in place. Duke moved beside Ethan, calm and observant as always. Then something almost invisible happened. Small enough most people might have missed it entirely. Emma smiled. Just a little. Barely there. But real. Lucy's eyes immediately filled with tears she tried hard to hide. She has not smiled much lately, she whispered softly. Ethan glanced toward the puppy, now spinning happily in circles around Emma's boots. Guess he does not know that. Milo barked once at the little girl, dropped into an awkward play bow, then accidentally slid face first into a snow shovel leaning against the wall. The loud clang startled everyone before Emma burst into laughter. Clear, bright, honest laughter that filled the garage like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Ethan felt Duke lean gently against his leg again, while somewhere deep inside that old garage, something wounded and quiet in all of them began healing together. The roads finally reopened 2 days later, though Blackwater still looked wrapped in winter sleep. Snowbanks lined the streets taller than car hoods, and every rooftop carried thick layers of white beneath the pale afternoon sun. The garage doors stood open for the first time since the storm began, letting cold mountain air drift inside alongside the distant sound of snowplows scraping asphalt. Ethan worked beneath another pickup truck, while Mason argued with an ancient cash register that jammed every third customer. Duke rested near the entrance, calm as a sentry, while Milo entertained himself by stealing gloves and hiding them in increasingly impossible places. By noon, 3 different customers had left the garage missing one mitten. I swear that puppy is running some kind of organized crime operation, Mason grumbled while searching beneath a stack of tires. Milo proudly trotted past, carrying somebody's wool sock in his mouth like a trophy. Duke glanced at him with deep disappointment again. Around mid-afternoon, Emma returned. This time she walked into the garage without hesitation, bundled in her oversized winter coat, while Lucy carried 2 paper cups of coffee from the diner. Peace offering, Lucy said warmly. For surviving my daughter's nonstop stories about the dogs. Ethan accepted the coffee with a small nod. Could be worse. Emma immediately knelt beside Milo, who rolled dramatically onto his back for belly rubs like they had known each other forever. The little girl laughed quietly while Duke moved closer and settled protectively beside them both. Lucy watched the scene with tired but grateful eyes. She used to love animals before. Her voice faded gently into the sound of rattling tools and humming heaters. Ethan understood anyway. Some grief did not need explaining. Mason suddenly cursed from behind the counter. Where's my wallet? Silence. Every human eye in the garage slowly turned toward Milo. The puppy froze mid-chew beside an old oil drum. Ethan narrowed his eyes. Milo. The puppy bolted instantly. Chaos erupted across the garage. Milo sprinted between tool carts while Mason chased after him, slipping wildly across the concrete floor. Duke remained perfectly still, visibly refusing involvement in the situation. Emma laughed so hard she nearly fell sideways into the tire rack. Finally, Milo darted beneath Ethan's truck and emerged proudly, carrying Mason's wallet in his mouth. Completely soaked. "That is leather," Mason shouted in betrayal. Ethan crouched carefully and held out his hand. "Bring it here." To everyone's surprise, Milo obeyed immediately. The puppy dropped the wallet gently into Ethan's palm before sitting down beside him, with innocent amber eyes full of absolutely no remorse. Lucy covered her smile behind the coffee cup. "He listens to you." Ethan looked down at the puppy for a moment longer than expected. "Maybe he just feels sorry for me." Duke huffed softly beside him, as if disagreeing. The afternoon sunlight shifted slowly through the open garage doors, casting long golden beams across floating dust and drifting steam from coffee cups. Outside, Blackwater continued thawing 1 quiet inch at a time. Inside, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor beside Duke while Milo curled clumsily into her lap, exhausted from criminal activity. The little girl absent-mindedly stroked the puppy's ears while humming softly under her breath. Lucy noticed it first. Her eyes widened slightly. "Emma," she whispered. The child looked up. "What?" It was only one word. "Small. Fragile." But the sound of her voice filled the garage with a stillness deeper than silence. Lucy pressed trembling fingers against her mouth as tears gathered in her eyes again. Ethan looked away respectfully, while Mason quietly removed his baseball cap. Duke rested his head across Emma's boots as Milo snored loudly against her coat, and somewhere beneath the smell of coffee, engine grease, melting snow, and warm fur, the old garage became something none of them had expected it to be. Not a repair shop, not a hiding place, something closer to home. 3 days later, the sky finally cleared above Blackwater. Sunlight spilled across the snowfields in blinding silver waves while thin sheets of ice dripped steadily from rooftops and telephone wires. The town felt awake again. Kids slid down frozen hills behind the church. Pickup trucks rolled slowly through slush-covered streets. Somewhere downtown, somebody played Old Johnny Cash through open diner windows. Inside the garage, warmth and noise filled every corner. Mason argued with a delivery driver over spark plugs while Milo proudly dragged an entire roll of paper towels across the floor like he had conquered a wild animal. Duke watched from beside the open garage door, calm and observant beneath the pale winter light. Ethan stood at the workbench repairing an old radio when his phone vibrated against the counter. He almost ignored it. Almost. The screen showed the shelter number. Something in his chest tightened immediately. Cole speaking. The woman on the other end sounded nervous. "Ethan, I am sorry to bother you, but we need to talk about Duke." Ethan glanced automatically toward the shepherd. Duke sat beside Emma near the tire rack, while the little girl quietly braided a strip of red yarn through his collar. The dog remained perfectly still for her. "What about him?" A pause. "Too long. There was an incident before we rescued him last year." Ethan's jaw tightened slowly. "What kind of incident?" Mason looked up from across the garage, instantly reading the change in Ethan's face. The woman exhaled carefully through the phone. Duke was surrendered after allegedly attacking a man outside Billings. Silence settled heavily around Ethan. The garage suddenly felt colder despite the heater rattling nearby. Allegedly, animal control classified him as dangerous at the time. Ethan stared at Duke again. The shepherd lifted his head slightly, as if sensing something shift in the room. "That does not sound like this dog." "I know," the woman admitted softly. But the paperwork resurfaced after somebody recognized him from town photos online. Mason stepped closer now. "What is going on?" Ethan lowered the phone slowly. "They are saying Duke attacked somebody." Emma immediately wrapped both arms tighter around the shepherd's neck. No, her small voice barely rose above the humming heater, but it stopped the room cold. Duke remained calm beside her, eyes steady, tail motionless against the floor. The shelter worker continued speaking through the phone. "There may be legal pressure to remove him temporarily until everything is reviewed." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. Marine hard. The kind that appeared only when something he cared about was threatened. "Nobody is taking that dog anywhere today." Mason crossed his arms beside him. "Not happening." Outside, tires crunched slowly across the snowy parking lot. A county vehicle pulled up near the garage entrance. Ethan saw the logo before the engine even shut off. Animal control. Emma's face paled. Milo, completely unaware of the tension, trotted happily toward the open door, carrying somebody's glove in his mouth. Duke stood now. Not aggressive. Not frightened. Just alert. Protective. Ethan crouched slowly beside him and rested one hand against the shepherd's neck. Warm fur beneath rough fingers. Steady breathing. Trust. Easy, buddy. The garage fell quiet except for the soft ticking of the heater and the distant drip of melting snow outside. Mason moved beside the doorway while Emma clung tightly to Duke's collar. The county officer stepped from the truck carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Tired eyes. Heavy boots crunching through slush. Ethan rose to his full height. You here for the dog? The officer stopped a few feet away and removed his glove slowly. Afraid so. Behind Ethan, Duke leaned gently against Emma, without making a sound, while Milo finally reached the officer and proudly dropped the stolen glove directly onto his boot. The county officer stood quietly in the garage entrance while melting snow dripped from the brim of his hat onto the concrete floor. He looked less like a man arriving for trouble and more like somebody tired of carrying bad news through cold weather. Milo sat proudly beside his boots, tail wagging hard after returning the stolen glove. The officer glanced down at the puppy and sighed softly. Well, that is probably the least threatening criminal I have seen all year. Nobody laughed. Emma still held tightly to Duke's collar, while the older shepherd remained pressed gently against her side. Calm. Steady. Ethan stepped forward first. You got paperwork? The officer nodded slowly and removed a folded file from beneath his coat. Standard review order. Mason crossed his arms. Review for what exactly? That dog has not hurt anybody. The officer hesitated before answering. Man from Billings reopened an old complaint after seeing Duke online. Ethan took the paperwork but barely looked at it. His eyes stayed fixed on the shepherd instead. Duke never barked, never growled. He simply watched the room with quiet alertness, ears twitching occasionally toward Emma whenever she shifted beside him. The officer rubbed one hand across his jaw. For what it is worth, I read the original report. He paused carefully. It never sat right with me. Ethan finally looked up. Meaning? The man glanced toward the open garage doors where sunlight reflected sharply off snowbanks outside. The guy claimed Duke attacked him outside an apartment complex. Another pause. But witnesses told a different story. Mason leaned forward slightly. Go on. The officer exhaled slowly through his nose. There was a little boy involved. Around 6 years old. Silence settled heavily through the garage again. Even Milo seemed to sense the mood shifting now, curling quietly against Emma's boots. Neighbors reported hearing yelling. The officer continued softly. When they came outside, Duke was standing between the man and the child. Ethan's jaw tightened. The officer shook his head. Dog never chased anybody. Never cornered anybody. Witnesses said he only reacted when the man grabbed the kid. Mason stared in disbelief. So Duke was protecting him. Looks that way. Emma slowly buried her face against Duke's neck while Lucy pressed trembling fingers against her mouth nearby. Ethan crouched carefully in front of the shepherd. You hear that, buddy? Duke blinked once at him beneath the pale winter sunlight pouring through the garage entrance. Calm amber eyes. Tired eyes. The kind carried by souls who had seen too much and still chose gentleness anyway. The officer shifted awkwardly. The complaint should have been dropped back then, honestly. But shelters get overcrowded. Paperwork gets ugly. Dogs like him fall through cracks. Ethan looked down at the folded file in his hand. His knuckles whitened slightly around the edges. Duke slowly rested his head against Ethan's shoulder. The gesture was small, quiet, but it broke something open inside the old Marine. Nobody protected him, Ethan said softly. The officer lowered his gaze. No, sir. Outside. Church bells rang faintly somewhere across town while wind carried the smell of pine and chimney smoke through the open doors. Blackwater moved peacefully beneath the winter sun, unaware of the little courtroom of wounded souls gathered inside the garage. Then Emma stepped forward. Her voice came small but clear. He stays. Every adult in the room looked at her. The little girl swallowed nervously before tightening her grip on Duke's collar again. Good dogs protect people. Duke leaned gently against her side once more. The officer stared at the child for a long moment before slowly folding the paperwork back into his coat. You know, he said quietly. Sometimes official reports miss the important part of the story. Mason finally breathed again. So what happens now? The officer looked down at Milo, who had fallen asleep chewing his own leash. Now, a faint smile crossed the man's tired face. Now I think this town already decided where that dog belongs. The next storm arrived faster than anyone expected. By early evening, the mountains disappeared again beneath thick rolling clouds, while sharp wind swept across Blackwater, carrying needles of ice through the streets. The radio warned residents to stay indoors after sunset, but in small towns, people rarely listened until weather forced them to. Inside the garage, heaters hummed steadily while Mason burned grilled cheese sandwiches for the second time that week. Charcoal adds flavor, he insisted. Ethan ignored him from beneath the hood of an old Jeep, while Duke rested nearby, chewing slowly on a rubber toy Emma had brought him earlier that afternoon. Milo chased snowflakes near the open garage door, barking furiously every time one touched his nose. The little shepherd had discovered weather existed purely to annoy him. Around 6:30 the phone rang. Mason answered first, balancing a spatula in one hand. Miller's garage. His expression changed instantly. Whoa, slow down. Ethan looked up. Mason covered the receiver. It is Lucy. Something in his voice made Ethan wipe his hands immediately. Mason listened another few seconds before turning pale. Emma is missing. Silence hit the garage hard. Outside, wind slammed against the building like a warning. Ethan grabbed his coat before Mason even finished explaining. Lucy's voice trembled through the phone speaker. Emma had gone outside looking for the stray orange cat she sometimes fed behind the diner. She never came back. Snow had started falling again less than 20 minutes later. Police are searching Main Street now, Lucy cried softly. Nobody can find her tracks anymore. Ethan's pulse sharpened instantly into old military focus. We are coming. He hung up and turned toward the dogs. Duke was already standing. Alert. Focused. As if he understood every word. Milo bounced excitedly nearby until Ethan knelt in front of him. No messing around tonight, little man. The puppy tilted his head seriously for once. Mason loaded flashlights and blankets into the truck while snow thickened outside the garage doors. The temperature had already dropped below 15 degrees. Dangerous cold for a child alone after dark. Within minutes, Blackwater became a blur of spinning white snow and flashing emergency lights. Volunteers searched sidewalks and alleys while deputies called Emma's name through loudspeakers that vanished into the storm. Lucy stood near the diner wrapped in a blanket, tears freezing against her cheeks. Ethan crouched beside Duke and held out Emma's wool scarf. Find her. The shepherd inhaled once, then immediately pulled forward into the storm. Strong. Certain. Ethan and Mason followed close behind, while Milo struggled through snowdrifts nearly taller than his legs. Wind roared through the streets hard enough to erase tracks within seconds. Duke kept moving. Past the church. Past the hardware store. Toward the frozen edge of town where pine woods climbed into the hills. She would not come out here alone, Mason shouted above the wind. Ethan trusted the dog more than the weather. More than fear. Duke suddenly stopped near the entrance to an abandoned logging trail half buried beneath snow. His ears lifted sharply. Then he barked once and lunged forward into the trees. Branches groaned overhead, while ice cracked beneath their boots. Snow swallowed sound so completely the world felt empty except for breathing and wind. Then somewhere ahead came a faint noise. Small. Fragile. A child crying. Ethan's heart slammed hard against his ribs. Emma. Duke charged through the snow faster now, while Milo stumbled after him determinately despite sinking almost to his belly every few steps. Finally, the flashlight beams found her. Emma sat curled beneath a fallen pine tree beside the shivering orange cat trapped against her coat. Snow covered her hat and shoulders completely. Duke reached her first, immediately pressing his warm body against the child, while Milo crawled clumsily into her lap. Emma burst into tears the moment she saw them. Ethan dropped to his knees beside her, breath shaking hard in the frozen air. You scared us, kiddo. Emma clung tightly to Duke's fur while snow swirled endlessly around them. And for one terrifying moment beneath the storm and darkness, Ethan realized the thought of losing any of them now hurt far more than he was ready to admit. The trip back through the storm felt longer somehow. Ethan carried Emma wrapped tightly inside his heavy winter coat, while the little orange cat peeked out nervously from beneath the blanket Mason had thrown around them both. Snow hammered sideways through the trees, stinging exposed skin and turning every breath into white clouds that vanished instantly into darkness. Duke stayed pressed close against Emma's legs the entire walk back, checking on her every few seconds like he needed constant proof she was still there. Milo stumbled through deep snow beside them with stubborn determination, his tiny paws nearly disappearing beneath the drifts. Twice Ethan bent down to carry the puppy too, but each time Milo squirmed free and kept going anyway. "That little idiot has the heart of a linebacker," Mason muttered through chattering teeth. By the time they reached town, flashing lights illuminated Main Street in red and blue reflections against the snowbanks. Lucy saw them first. She ran forward through the storm before anybody could stop her, boots slipping against the icy pavement as tears streamed down her face. "Emma." The little girl buried herself instantly into her mother's arms, while the orange cat escaped beneath a parked truck the second nobody was watching. Lucy held her daughter so tightly Ethan thought she might never let go again. Around them, volunteers lowered flashlights and exhaled relief into the freezing night air. Somebody quietly thanked God beneath their breath. But Ethan barely heard any of it. His attention locked immediately onto Duke. The older shepherd had finally stopped moving. Snow covered his dark coat almost completely now, while his breathing came slower than before. Too slow. Ethan crouched beside him instantly. "Hey." Duke lifted tired amber eyes toward him, but did not stand. Mason noticed too. "He is freezing." The shepherd had spent nearly an hour pressed against Emma beneath that fallen tree while the storm worsened around them, protecting her, keeping her warm. Ethan removed his gloves and pressed both hands against Duke's sides, feeling the cold soaked through his fur. "Come on, buddy." Slowly, Duke tried to rise. His legs trembled once before Ethan caught him gently beneath the chest. The dog leaned heavily against him without resistance. That scared Ethan more than anything else had tonight. Back at the garage, heaters blasted warm air, while Mason piled blankets beside the workbench. Lucy stayed with Emma near the couch, whispering soft promises into her daughter's hair, while townspeople drifted home one by one through the fading storm. The garage smelled like wet wool, coffee, melting snow, and tired relief. Milo curled tightly against Duke's side the moment Ethan lowered the older shepherd onto the blankets. For once the puppy made no noise. No chaos. Just quiet, worried eyes fixed on his friend. Ethan sat beside Duke on the concrete floor long after everyone else settled down. He rubbed towels slowly through the shepherd's damp fur while the old heater rattled overhead. "You stubborn dog," he whispered softly. Duke blinked once at him, exhausted but calm. Mason approached carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "Vet says keep him warm and let him rest." Ethan nodded without looking away from the shepherd. Outside, snow still drifted gently past the garage windows, softer now. Peaceful almost. Emma quietly walked over wearing one of Mason's oversized hoodies that nearly swallowed her whole. She knelt carefully beside Duke and placed her tiny hand against his neck. "He saved me." Ethan swallowed hard. "Yeah." The little girl looked toward him with sleepy red eyes. "You saved him too." For a moment nobody spoke. The garage hummed softly with heater noise and distant wind, while Duke rested his head across Ethan's boot and Milo pressed close against his side like a small heartbeat refusing to leave. Then Ethan finally understood something the Marines had never taught him. Some souls survive war. Others survive loneliness. But the rarest kind of miracle is finding something willing to stay beside you after both. By the end of the week, the storm had passed completely. Sunlight returned to Blackwater in soft golden layers that melted ice from rooftops and turned the snowbanks into glittering rivers along the streets. The whole town seemed quieter afterward, as if surviving winter together had worn everybody down into kindness. Inside Miller's auto garage, the old place no longer resembled the lonely building Ethan first hid inside months ago. There were dog bowls near the heater now, children's drawings taped beside tool cabinets, extra blankets folded near the couch. Somebody had even hung Christmas lights across the rafters despite the holiday being long over. Mason claimed it improved morale. Ethan suspected he simply liked the colors. Duke recovered slowly over several days, though he refused to stay still longer than necessary. The moment Emma visited after school each afternoon, The older shepherd somehow found enough strength to stand and greet her at the door. Milo remained attached to Duke constantly, like an over-caffeinated little brother assigned to emotional support duty. Wherever Duke walked, Milo followed, usually sideways, sometimes upside down. I think that puppy would follow him into traffic, Mason muttered one morning while watching Milo attempt to carry a wrench larger than his entire body. Ethan glanced toward the dogs beneath the workbench and quietly smiled. He did that more now. Smiled. Slept better too. Some nights, he even left the radio playing low country music instead of sitting awake in silence, waiting for memories to return. The biggest change came on Saturday morning. A woman from the neighboring county arrived with 2 abandoned shepherd mixes rescued after the storm. Thin, nervous, covered in mud and burrs. She stepped carefully into the garage holding both leashes while Duke watched calmly from beside Ethan's chair. Shelter is full, the woman explained softly. I heard maybe you folks could help temporarily. Ethan should have refused immediately. That would have been the old version of him. Less complicated that way. Less dangerous. Attachment always carried risk. Loss. Grief. But before he could answer, Milo trotted over to the frightened dogs with his tail wagging wildly. One of the rescues backed away nervously. Milo simply sat down and dropped a tennis ball between them like a tiny furry diplomat negotiating peace talks. Mason snorted coffee through his nose laughing. Duke slowly walked over next. Calm. Gentle. The frightened dogs relaxed almost instantly beside him. Ethan watched the scene unfold beneath warm garage light and drifting dust particles glowing gold in the morning sun. Something settled quietly inside his chest then. Not dramatic. Not loud. Just certain. Bring them in, he said. Mason looked up immediately. You serious? Ethan shrugged lightly. Garage is big enough. Lucy arrived later carrying homemade chili for everyone while Emma helped spread blankets near the heater for the new dogs. By afternoon, the old garage echoed with barking, laughter, clanging tools, and the warm noise of people no longer hiding from one another. Duke rested near the entrance watching everything peacefully while Milo attempted to steal half the cornbread cooling on the counter. Mason caught him mid-crime. Absolutely not. Milo barked back in protest. Outside, Blackwater glowed beneath clear winter skies while smoke curled gently from chimneys and fresh snow melted slowly beneath the afternoon sun. Ethan stood in the garage doorway with one hand resting against Duke's neck, listening to the strange, beautiful chaos filling the building behind him. For years he thought healing would feel bigger than this. Louder somehow, like fireworks or miracles falling from heaven. But it did not. It sounded like dogs barking across warm concrete floors. Like children laughing beside old engines. Like tired people finally finding somewhere they belonged. And as Duke leaned quietly against his side beneath the fading Montana sunlight, Ethan realized some homes are not found. They are built one rescued soul at a time. Spring arrived quietly in Blackwater. Not all at once. Just little signs at first. Snow melting from fence posts. Mud returning to the roads. The sound of birds replacing the long winter wind outside the garage each morning. By April, the mountains no longer looked harsh from town. They looked protective, almost gentle. Miller's auto garage had changed too. The old building now carried fresh paint near the front entrance where Emma insisted the place needed more happy colors. Somebody built wooden dog beds beside the heater. Lucy started bringing breakfast every Saturday morning whether anyone asked her to or not. And somehow, despite repeated objections from Mason, there were now 5 dogs sleeping inside the garage every night. We are running a mechanic shop, Mason grumbled one afternoon while stepping over Milo and 2 shepherd mixes tangled together near the tool chest. Not a furry daycare center. Milo immediately stole the sandwich from Mason's hand and sprinted away across the garage floor. Criminal, Mason shouted, chasing after him while everyone laughed. Ethan leaned against the open garage door watching sunlight spill across Main Street. Duke sat beside him as always, larger now somehow despite age and scars and all the things life had already asked him to survive. The old shepherd watched the town calmly with wise amber eyes while children rode bicycles through puddles nearby. Ethan scratched slowly behind Duke's ears. You did all this, huh? Duke simply leaned heavier against his leg. Inside the garage, Emma sat cross-legged beside the younger dogs drawing pictures on scrap cardboard while Lucy helped Mason reorganize shelves he claimed were already organized. Country music drifted softly from the radio near the office. Coffee brewed somewhere in the background. Tools clinked. Dogs barked. People laughed. The sound wrapped around Ethan gently, like warmth finding a man who stopped expecting it years ago. Then the bell above the garage door rang again. Another customer stepped inside, carrying a cardboard box filled with abandoned puppies rescued from a roadside ditch 20 miles outside town. Tiny things, barely old enough to walk straight. Mason looked toward Ethan immediately. Do not even think about it. Ethan stared at the trembling puppies for a long moment, while Milo barked excitedly nearby, and Duke slowly walked over to inspect the box with calm patience. One of the puppies climbed clumsily against Duke's paw. The old shepherd lowered his head and licked the tiny pup once across the forehead. Gentle, careful, like he understood exactly what fear felt like. Lucy smiled softly from across the garage. Looks like they already found the right place. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Months ago, he would have said no. Months ago, this garage had only been a hiding place for two lonely Marines carrying ghosts nobody else could see. But somewhere between snowstorms and laughter and muddy paw prints across concrete floors, life had returned when neither man was looking for it. Ethan crouched beside the cardboard box and carefully lifted one trembling puppy into his arms. Guess we are going to need more dog beds. Mason groaned dramatically toward the ceiling while Emma cheered loud enough for half the town to hear. Outside, sunlight stretched across Blackwater beneath a clear Montana sky, while warm spring wind carried the scent of pine trees and thawed earth through the open garage doors. Duke rested quietly beside Ethan, watching the little chaotic family gathered around him now. No medals, no headlines, no grand victory speeches. Just rescued souls finding one another in an old garage at the edge of a small town. And as laughter echoed softly through the building and Milo proudly stole another sandwich in the background, Ethan finally understood something simple enough to save a life. Sometimes grace does not arrive with thunder. Sometimes it shows up covered in fur, dragging muddy paws across your broken heart until it feels like home again.